Welcome back. So far in our study of the Reformation, we've seen what are called the magisterial reformers. That would be Luther, Zwingli, and Calvin. Now we're going to take up a sort of parallel study, an important study also of developments during the Reformation period. We call this the Radical Reformation, and we'll explain that as we go along here. These are developments that weren't the major sort of, again, magisterial developments, but very important ones involving some groups that their heritage still survives today. And so it's important to make sure that we cover them and understand them as best we can. Also, in this with this particular set of notes that you have, we are going to divide those notes up into three separate video lectures. So you'll be using this set of notes with the next three lectures. I'm trying to break these up a little to try and make them a little shorter, and they divide up pretty well. So you'll kind of see how that goes, and I'll try to make that clear as we go along. So let's turn to what's called the Radical Reformation. That sounds a little more dramatic. I hope I can explain as we go along than what it is. But again, we're going to be looking here in this video at the beginnings of the Radical Reformation, so-called. So let's get to that. The Radical Reformation goes by has one major name called Anabaptism. And Anabaptism is, we're going to see, was a more or less pejorative term that was applied to these folks, which they didn't like, as we'll see, but nevertheless, it's a name that has stuck. Anabaptism is a term used to describe a movement that was identified as the Radical Reformation, again in distinction from the Magisterial Reformation of the 16th century. The term Anabaptism comes from the Greek ana, which means new or again, and baptizo, to baptize. And so Anabaptism signifies a new baptism or rebaptism, which is how they were viewed by those that, among the Catholics, and again, even among the magisterial reformers that baptized infants, they saw Anabaptists baptizing adult believers as something, again, beyond what had been the traditional practice. And so they coined this term, Anabaptism. It was applied, as it says, to this movement because of its repudiation of infant baptism, that of both Roman Catholicism, which was a sort of baptismal regeneration view, and Protestantism, which views the baptism of infants as bringing them into membership within the covenant. And that's what a number of groups still hold who practice infant baptism within Protestant camp. Anabaptism also broke from the centuries-old church-state relation, insisting that instead that churches be free of state influence and control. And this might actually be the more serious development for both theology and the history of Anabaptism and what they had to deal with. That it's not so much the rebaptism, but this insistence that the church-state relation be re-envisioned, as we will see, and that's what brought them a lot of the difficulty and persecution that they had to face. Other Anabaptist emphases included regeneration. Now, all Christians believe in regeneration of some fashion or another, but their view of regeneration is very specific and a little more particular, again, as we'll see later when we talk about their theology. Nonviolence, what that meant was they didn't go to war, they didn't retaliate. Again, it was a doctrine of that's developed, maybe not in these first Anabaptists, as we'll see, but developed later as what has come to be known as pacifism. And there are various levels of pacifistic doctrine. And again, that would entail a study of more current Anabaptism, concerned more with the historical development of it here. They had certain ideas about how discipleship was supposed to work. Particularly, they were known for separation from the world, and that continues, as well as care for the poor, and basically very much care among themselves, as we will see. It's important to note at this point that Anabaptists, as such, should not be confused with Baptists. Baptists were developed as basically the kind of Baptists we all might be familiar with from the English Baptists who came from out of the Puritans. And the Baptists were people that had some similarities in the sense that they wanted the Reformation to go further in England. We're going to talk about that in upcoming lectures. But and wanted to return to the New Testament church of baptizing believers. But that's pretty much where the similarity ends between English Baptists, or the kind of Baptists we might be familiar with today in terms of certain denominations, and these Anabaptists. Anabaptists today are people like the Mennonites or the Brethren and such. And so, again, just keep that in mind. So if you know some Baptist friends, it's not correct to refer to them as Anabaptists. Anabaptism was a movement within the Protestant Reformation. The movement's most notable position was adult baptism. In its first generation, followers participated in a second baptism, which again, that was from the standpoint of their enemies, their opponents, which was a violation condemned by death following the law of that era. So just rebaptizing someone who had been baptized as an infant and baptizing them as an adult, now professed believer in Protestant doctrines, was taken as a serious problem, even heresy. Members, however, they themselves renounced the name of baptism or rebaptizer, as they disavowed their own baptism as children as a sacrilegious ceremony. So they in their understanding, baptizing babies was just as much an offense to their understanding theologically as rebaptizing adults was to those who held to infant baptism on the other side. Anabaptists believed that the open declaration or confession of sin and faith followed by adult baptism was the solely righteous form of baptism. So again, one side saw the other side as making a serious theological error in practice. What are the basic ideas of the Anabaptists? The Anabaptists taught that baptism, being an emblem of sincere conversion of the heart to faith in Christ. Now again, that would be something that many current Baptists would say. So there, as I said, there's some similarities in that regard, but that baptism could be undertaken only by adults. Hence, they performed baptisms on persons who had already been baptized as infants. Again, they rejected the term Anabaptist, however, on the not unreasonable grounds that according to their beliefs, they never had been truly baptized. So even if they'd been, quote-unquote, baptized as infants by their parents, they didn't recognize that as a legitimate baptism. So when they were baptized as believers, they saw that as the only real baptism. And so they rejected the title. One of their early advocates, you might say theologians, Balthasar Hubmaier, said, "I have never taught Anabaptism, but the right baptism of Christ, which is preceded by teaching and oral confession of faith. I teach and say that infant baptism is the robbery of the right baptism of Christ." The Anabaptists, much like the Protestant Reformers, were resolved to renew the traditions and essence of the archaic, or we would say early church, and frequently recognized their affliction with that of the martyrs of the early church. So they thought that they were returning to the true early church. Well, that's the magisterial reformers. That's what they were saying too. Only the Anabaptists said we need to go further. Many were convinced that they were existing at the end of time, anticipated the impending return of Christ. So this is one of many movements that saw themselves as living in the end times and acted accordingly in terms of their commitment and devotion and their resistance to the things of the world. Originally, the Anabaptists had been associated with Zwingli's Reformation, but as we're going to see, were repudiated by Zwingli himself. What became the Anabaptist movement began among those who followed, as I say, Ulrich Zwingli. Anabaptism in Switzerland developed from Zwingli's early supporters. They saw Zwingli as returning to the early church. They saw him as trying to reform the church and get back to the way the church was in the first century or first centuries. But they thought that Zwingli wasn't moving fast enough, and they wanted to go back. I should stop and say this is the point about why we call it the radical Reformation. Not because it was radical in politics or anything, but radical means root, and they wanted to get back to the root. They wanted to get back to the original church as they saw it, again in the book of Acts, or the first century, and so that's why they were called radical. Again, that was not a term that they applied to themselves, and it's not as a pejorative a term as it might sound, but just again for reasons of clarity, they wanted to get back to the roots. Back to the slide. For different reasons, some of the radicals, there it is, became disillusioned with Zwingli's reform, and seeing the church as an alternative authority to Rome, they desired Zwingli to proceed rapidly to purify the church's religious establishment, such as the corruptions of the Mass. As we saw under Zwingli, eventually they did do away with the Mass, but for these folks, it wasn't happening fast enough. As when Zwingli allowed the city council to determine the speed of the Reformation, that is, basically the secular government determined how fast they could move in their reforming zeal, it seemed to the radicals that the substitution of the one oppressive authority for another. As a rule, this branch of the Reformation, at least in its earliest forms, again we saw was influenced by Zwingli. Its followers therefore felt no great anxiety with withholding baptism from their own children, and that was a problem for many of the people that in that day, for those people committed to those doctrines, to withhold your child from baptism could be equivalent to withholding them from being saved or going to heaven if they were to die in infancy. And so they believed that was a serious problem. But the Anabaptists said, well, that's not even a real baptism, so they didn't really attach any great guilt or significance to that. They thought that the child had to reach the age of reason, or what you might call today the age of accountability. Unlike Zwingli, however, Anabaptist communities tended towards political and social separation and regarded civil allegiances, litigations, that is, going to court, suing one another, military service, and civil oaths. Civil oaths would be things like swearing in a court of law that you would tell the truth, or swearing allegiance to a city or the king or whatever. All of these things were contrary to genuine Christian adherence, that is, practice. Some of them were political radicals as well, inspired by a theocratic messianism. See, they thought the end times were coming and they should sort of start preparing for the reign of Christ on earth. In general, however, they were nonviolent in principle, as we're going to see. That was something that didn't happen early on, but again becomes more a hallmark of their later theology. In the city of Zurich, Zwingli tried to persuade them from their errors, in private and in public, but they had several disputations. Following two public disputations, the magistracy, that is the city authorities, city rulers, ruled against the Anabaptists and threatened them with expulsion from the city if they did not start practicing paedobaptism and stop practicing rebaptisms of believers. They refused to submit, and the leaders were arrested and charged with being revolutionaries in their teaching. The civil authorities implemented the penalty by death of drowning, so I guess that was meant to be sort of ironic. He who dips, we shall be dipped, is the cruel parody of the Anabaptist doctrine, and drowning was referred to as the third baptism. You can see that it was a fairly harsh sort of exchange. And 6 executions occurred in Zurich between 1527 and 1532. The picture you have there is of a Anabaptist being drowned much later, as late as 1592. So, kind of persecution that began at the outset of the Anabaptist movement continued on for quite a while. At the end of the day, they were rejected by everybody. As noted, the Anabaptists were persecuted from the very outset of the movement, and inasmuch as their views were repugnant to Catholic and Protestants alike, they were persecuted by Catholics and Protestants wherever they went. If any 16th century Western communion could identify itself with the Church of the Martyrs, again back in the 1st century, that would certainly be true of the Anabaptists. And again, we're going to see that a part of the problem, as you might have been able to discern from this so far, that it wasn't just their rejection of infant baptism, but that put them at odds with the civil authorities, with essentially the secular government. And that's because in that day, there wasn't much of a division between the quote-unquote secular government and secular authorities, as we would call them, and the authority of the church. And that was also a part of the difficulty. We'll see that a little bit more as we move on. So I'm going to stop here with this particular video. We will pick it up, as I say, with the same set of notes, still talking about the Anabaptists, and we'll get a little bit of the history of the movement after its beginning, which we've just seen.